start, I wanted to give a short overview to the participants what has happened during this conference in the last days. So this conference was about resilience and about the question how Europe can leapfrog to resilience. So on Tuesday, we had a keynote with Kate Raworth and one policy lab that tried to answer this question for the dimension of a green recovery and for a just transition. So that was Tuesday. So the environmental challenges and the social challenges. On Thursday, a panel opened by Sandrine Dixon de Cleve from the Club of Rome and other leaders from various DGs of the Commission. We had a policy lab on governance. So what does this mean for governance? And also Vice President Šefčovič commented already on the results of this policy lab. And today we had a policy lab on fiscal policy. So what does resilience mean for fiscal policy, and how can fiscal policy better take into account the long-term priorities of the EU, especially the environmental priorities? So I'm now very happy to welcome here Valdis Dombrovskis. We have the honor that you shortly comment on the outcomes of the policy lab. So the conference was a co-creative conference, so not like a typical conference where you just have panels, but actually participants really engaged with each other and interacted and tried to develop, potential ideas and solutions that can inspire political action. So I will present some of these ideas in the Q&A session that we will have after your speech. And before that, also, of course, maybe we didn't shake hands yet, right? So I don't know, we can do a digital handshake.
Virtually, yeah. Okay.
So, well, I think I give you the floor to start and to open the discussion, and then we will lead up with the Q&A session. Thank you for being here, Valdis Dombrovskis.
Okay, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank Zohr Institute for inviting me to talk about longer-term policy issues related to this crisis. The pandemic has caused probably the greatest social and economic disruption which most of us have ever faced. What Europe needs now is sustainable economic recovery, a strong, fair, inclusive recovery, and also recovery that prepares us for challenges of green and digital transition. So we need to prepare for future challenges and also strengthen our economic and social resilience. All this will require significant investment and reforms. These are the main focus of EU's 750 billion euros recovery plan, Next Generation EU, and combined with a reinforced budget for the next 7 years, this gives us a package of financial firepower of 1.82 trillion euros. As I said recently, this should be a ship that keeps us afloat and gets us through the storm. It is an opportunity to invest in Europe's next generations. Making the right policy and investment choices now is more important than ever. The plan's cornerstone is Recovery and Resilience Facility. It will finance reforms and investments undertaken by national governments, and it will be the driving force behind a successful recovery. And our plan looks into future too. So while we must deal with the immediate health impact and economic fallout, perhaps a greater challenge will be to address longer-term issues such as green and digital transitions. But they hold a key to Europe's prosperity, and this is why 37% of the Recovery and Resilience Facility will be spent directly on our green objectives. And Europe's commitment to go climate neutral by 2050 remains very much in place. In this week's State of the Union speech, President von der Leyen confirmed European Commission's commitment to raise EU's 2030 target to cutting emissions of at least 55%. To pay for this ambitious plan, it's clear that we must rely also on private finance. Public funds alone will not be enough. So I will continue to work on promoting sustainable finance and green investments. So we plan to raise 30% of Next Generation's EU, 750 billion euros, through green bonds. And in addition, I will present a renewed green finance action plan by the end of the year. Then it's worth noting that Europe's economy will only work if it works for everyone. So it has to be as fair, even, and inclusive as possible. This is because crisis is affecting companies and workers very differently around the European Union, and also depending on a sector of the economy. So we will invest in developing skills. We will continue to support companies and workers. We will do our best to close economic, social, and territorial inequalities across our continent. To give a concrete example, we will soon propose an EU minimum wage framework. Well, ladies and gentlemen, there is a lot more one could say, but I know time is limited. So let me just underline, while these are clear opportunities for Europe, there are also risks, but risks we should take. It's time for looking forward, not back. It's a chance to do things better, for Europe to stay ahead and prosper in the recovery and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dombrovskis. So I think, this was a very good overview also about the recent changes or adjustments that have been made, especially the 37% of the spending that will go to green sectors. And we will dive into these content-related issues in a minute. But before we go into depth, I would like to give the audience the opportunity to get you to know a little bit. So you studied physics and economics, right? So I have a very personal, similar experience personally. So I also studied economics at the chair for theoretical physics. So because of that, I wanted to ask you, what did you take from physics to economics? Because from my experience, my understanding of the economy benefited a lot from the system thinking that we have in physics. So did you have a similar experience, and what did you take from physics to economics?
Exactly. I think you framed already very well. In a sense, what you learn in physics is how to address problems, how to systematically solve problems. You also learn from physics that often you need to optimize different parameters of the systems. When you are gaining in one direction, you may be losing in another direction. So it's not so easy to declare simple and the only true answer to the problems. And I have taken, I would say, this approach of solving problems from physics also when dealing with economics and dealing also with governance issues in the government, but also in a European Commission.
So did you ever imagine back then that you one time will use all that knowledge to lead Europe through a crisis like the one that it is currently facing?
Well, not necessarily. You know, life is full of different twists and turns. And of course, in 1990s, when I was studying physics, I was not really thinking that one day I would become a Prime Minister of Latvia or Executive Vice President of the Commission and would deal with issues on such a global scale.
Well, I think we could probably talk a lot about now physics and economics. So it's one topic that interests me a lot. But I'm a little afraid that we might lose the audience and bore it a little bit if we go too much into the details. So let's go back to the topic. So you mentioned that the plan is about looking forward. It's about the long-term challenges the EU is facing. Also, the conference was exactly looking at the long term, right? So what will be in 5 years from now? Where will the member states stay and what will they need? You also mentioned already your quote that the Next Generation EU budget its objective is to keep the EU afloat in raw seas and get us through the storm. So you already mentioned many of the topics that have or of the different pieces the package includes, but like how did the next well, why did you design it that way? What was the guiding principle that that you had in mind when you were thinking about designing Next Generation EU?
Well, Next Generation EU had to address first and foremost, of course, immediate problems. So it's clear that Next Generation EU came as a response to the pandemics and to the economic crisis caused by the pandemics. And in that sense, there is probably a bit of a blessing in disguise that in February of this year, EU leaders were not able to agree on EU's multi-annual budget for the next 7 years. So this gave us actually an opening to come back with an ambitious EU budget for 7 years and to top it up with 750 billion euros Next Generation EU. But what we also were very mindful of that when we are now working for the recovery, we do not want just to come back to the status quo pre-crisis. So we want to use this additional funding to really drive the green and digital transformations of the economy. So to invest in the technologies of future and not in the past. So when you are looking at our Next Generation EU, also now on the documents we recently published, like Annual Sustainable Growth Strategy for the next year, which and additional guidance to member states on how to work on this recovery plan. It also has a number of flagship projects in green and clean technologies, also on digitalization. So indeed that we use this money to shift the economy towards a green and a digital future. And that's where also the mainstreaming goals come in there to avoid confusion. So we have a 30% mainstreaming target for the next 7 years EU budget and the Next Generation EU as a whole. And the 37% target, which I mentioned, is specifically for recovery and resilience facility, which is probably the biggest part of our recovery plan.
Okay, so this is how the 30% translate into the 37%. So, of course, navigating through a storm needs different things, and I will use this picture while we navigate through our discussion here. So one thing that we talked about in the Green Recovery Lab on Tuesday was that you also need a good compass, right? And you mentioned already the green transition, so it was on green recovery, and this is why I shortly want to show you one slide that we also previously discussed with members of the Commission. Can we see the slide of the donut, please? Thank you. So one idea was that because this is not the only storm, as you said, you have to look forward, and at the horizon there are already the other storms appearing, right? So I'm talking about climate change and biodiversity loss here. So many people already feel these storms. They're already affected by stronger heat waves, by floods, by droughts, and so forth. So one compass that we looked at, or the idea was that could guide the recovery and also maybe the development of the Green Deal, was a donut. So this is not straightforward because the donut first sounds like something very different, but I don't know whether you have read the book from Kate Raworth, but she presented the donut as the new compass for the 21st century. And you see on the outer ceiling here, this is the ecological ceiling, that's the outer ring, right? So this is the planetary boundaries which we should not transgress and where we should not overshoot. So this includes climate change, you see at the top, biodiversity loss, freshwater withdrawal, land conversion. And then you have the inner link, or the inner ring, so the Europe's social foundation. So this is where we should not fall short. So these are the things that really matter to the people, right? So access to food, energy, water, housing, but also not only the material things, but social networks and relationships. I think that became very clear in the crisis, then when we couldn't connect and couldn't interact, that this is really a major source of well-being for people. So the idea was that this donut, this compass, could actually serve as a picture to monitor also the Green Deal and make it easily accessible where the EU is currently moving. So what do you think about this idea that was developed in one of the policy labs?
Yeah, well, I think this graph, as you call it, donut, reflects very well on some of the thinking also in European Commission. So we need to move towards green and digital transitions, but we will only be successful if we will do at socially acceptable way. In a sense, if we will not forget Europe's social foundations. As it said here, that's why we're paying so much attention to this concept of inclusive recovery, that we are not letting people, sectors, regions, that we are not letting people, sectors, regions behind. So that's a idea of this inclusive recovery. All in all, it should be doable, because when you look at the green transition, when we proposed European Green Deal, we did an impact assessment, and the conclusion was that European Green Deal movement to the carbon neutrality will have a moderately positive effect on both economic development and jobs. So all in all, it's going to have a positive effect, but at the same time, we need to manage the transition properly. And on this transition, that's where our proposals, for example, on just transition mechanism and just transition fund are coming in. That's where European skills agenda is coming in, actually, to prepare people for this new kind of jobs green and digital economy will bring. And in general, we should be looking on how we decouple economic growth from emissions. To the extent it's already happening, if you look since 1990, Europe's economy has grown more than 60%. Europe's emissions has reduced by some 25%, but of course, we need to do more. But I would say the basic concept which is presented here is very clear. We need to do our green transition, but in a socially acceptable way.
Thank you. So I think the discussion came from a point where people said often like pictures are missing that guide us and can serve as a vision, right? So because if you look, for example, at the social scoreboard, but also if you look at the resilience dashboard that was now developed, I think it's really complex for like the average people or general people that are not like engaged in politics all the time to really understand what are these things about. Do you think a picture like this can maybe serve to maybe communicate better what the EU tries to achieve?
Yes, we are dealing with complex issues, and well, it's not always easy to present them in a very simple way, or if it's done, it's often provides a very simplified picture and lots of nuances are being lost. So I think this is, as we were discussing, a good way of presenting things on this green and social. And I think in general, it's very important to make this point and to really demonstrate this point, how green economy is affecting incomes, how green economy is affecting jobs, because overall, as we just discussed, the effect is positive. So we need to see how we really support those people which are or sectors or regions which are being left behind by this transition, to ensure that they are also managing this transition in a successful way. So I think that's the key question for social acceptance of this transition.
And I think it's interesting to see that the EU really leads on an international level also, right? That in combining these challenges and really thinking both on about the fairness and the justice, and on the other hand also about the planetary boundaries, so to say, and where we have to get. So you mentioned the impact assessments that accompanied the speech of the president. So the impact assessment, of course, includes also quite some fundamental changes, right? So you also said CO2 emissions did decouple from economic growth, but they only decreased by 25%, right? So if we have to go to 55% by 2030, we have to do more than we already did in the last 30 years in like 10 years. So this is like a really great acceleration we have to see there, right? So the president said that this means that we need to change how we produce and consume, live and work, eat and heat. And this is a systemic transformation of all different sectors. And of course, like the impact assessment shows, it also includes like steel and the car industry and so forth. So this will of course involve difficult decisions on the member state level. So member states will have to come up with ideas how they actually support the changes that are outlined in the impact assessment. So how would you react if you see that the recovery and resilience plans maybe fall short and actually really taking serious these changes, and because those member states might fear those difficult decisions?
Well, first of all, we will engage closely with member states, and that's why we communicated very clear for Recovery Resilience Facility. 37% mainstreaming target for green, 20% for digital. So we will be following that member states are really presenting plans which are meeting these ambitions. And of course, there has to be scope also for dealing with country-specific issues, country-specific challenges. That also is linked with the European semester comes in, where we coordinate fiscal and macroeconomic policies of the member states. But then you mentioned this, that indeed, if we are to reach 55% emissions reduction by 2030, in the next decade, we have to do more than we did in previous 3 decades. That's true. But at the same time, we are also, the preconditions for advancing also are much better. If you look, for example, renewable energies, they are on a number of occasions already commercially viable, so they do not require massive public subsidies as they were probably in the 90s and early 2000s. Many countries are phasing out coal. Some already have phased it out. Many are phasing out in coming years. We are proposing a very big program, what we call renovation way, because one of the largest source of emissions is actually housing sector, buildings. So we need to improve energy efficiency of buildings. We need to higher standards for new buildings, and we need to retrofit older buildings. Electromobility is also on a brink of taking off, and one of the flagship projects which we are proposing is developing the charging stations network across the EU, so that electromobility can also move ahead from infrastructure point of view. We're discussing how to more actively use carbon sinks, for example, through forestry, through biomass, using of wood in construction. Of course, there is another side of the coin, which is sustainable forestries, and we need to be very clear on this. So there are many things in which we are much more advanced now than we were a few decades ago, which will allow us actually to move much faster in the next 10 years than in the previous years.
Yeah, I hope that of course this really happens. I mean, future is always uncertain, but I think that the level of ambition that the Commission shows points in the right direction. And of course, yeah, I mean, some say it's still too little, but I think it's a great step that they already we increased the goal from 40 to 55% in 2030. However, I have to ask one question associated to this again. So the member states have to do that, right? So they are the ones that are really supporting businesses in establishing the charging stations. They have to support the economy, that they actually, that there are enough skills to really renovate all these houses. And so would there be a point when you say to member states, okay, no, this is not sufficient, you should come up with maybe more ambitious proposals? So is there a point like this? Can you imagine that?
Well, there may be a point like this. In any case, we'll be engaging closely with member states as they are preparing their recovery resilience plans, also just transition plans. So if member states will not be meeting the climate mainstreaming targets, indeed, we may need to tell member states that they need to be more ambitious on this area. But frankly, there is enough to do. If you look at the different sectors of economy, different technologies, there is enough to do. There is enough projects, there is enough infrastructure developments in which this money can be invested and should be invested if we want to reach climate neutrality goal. Good.
I think one thing that also links to another policy lab, I'm building a bridge here, is yours also mentioned it, fiscal policy, right? So you said that some member states are already phasing out coal. And what we talked about today in the lab on fiscal policy was the question on tax exemptions. So there are, of course, like the fiscal system as it is, or the design of fiscal policy right now, only to a certain extent really takes into account environmental externalities. So the idea was that we actually really, also in the moment where we are right now, rethink these tax exemptions. For example, fossil fuel in Germany, you have some indirect subsidies because some taxes are lower for fossil fuel than for other fuels, like diesel, for example. That's what I'm talking about here. And so one idea was that these tax exemptions can actually also be a chance to, or rethinking them can be a chance to also address the higher debt levels that member states will face after the crisis, right? So to increase or broaden the tax base. What would you think about a proposal like this?
Well, it's very clear that taxation will have to be a part of the picture. And European Commission already has announced several concrete proposals. For example, we would propose reform of emission trading system, with including, so to say, phasing out exemptions from carbon-intensive industries, and ensuring dealing with the problem of carbon leakage through carbon border adjustment mechanism. So this is something which Commission has clearly announced, and we are currently working on this legislative proposal. We have announced a review of energy taxation directive, because last time it was reviewed was in 2003. And indeed, there are many modernizations which would be needed to ensure more effective taxation of fossil fuels. So review of energy taxation directive. We are looking at EU-owned resources. Actually, currently, the only agreement on a new own resource is the tax on unrecycled plastic or plastic waste. But certainly one can look more in the direction of natural resources taxes. So clearly the taxation will also have a role to play here.
And of course, I mean, the taxation on the member state level does not fall into the competence of the Commission, but at least you can, within the negotiations around the resilience and recovery plans, you can provide guidance. So will the Commission, sorry?
Actually, here there are quite a few areas where taxation falls within the competence of the European Union, like indirect taxation. When I discuss, for example, this energy taxation directive, here we are talking mostly about excises on fossil fuels, for example. And this is clearly EU competence, so we will be coming with a new proposal. Of course, to agree, it requires unanimity of member states, and that often proves difficult. But currently, there seems to be a political momentum to move forward with a Green Deal. So we hope there will be also political momentum to adjust taxation. Carbon border adjustment mechanism, since here we are talking about aspects which are closely linked to the external trade. Trade is also EU competence, so clearly here we also have competence. On plastic tax, it was already agreed to have it as an EU own resource. So there are things which can be done also at EU level, but of course there are many things which also would need to be done at member states level.
So one thing, for example, that is discussed, or also was discussed, is that we shift actually taxation from taxing labor to taxing environmental externalities. I mean, as an economist, you know that there is a big market failure that we see there, right? So this is something that was included in previous recommendations within the European semester before. So do you think that this is again something that member states have to talk about and think about, how they can like shift the tax burden from what we actually want, jobs, to what we don't want, like environmental bads, right?
Well, indeed, and this is something which we are following up within European semester, and indeed this has been consistently the general direction of country-specific recommendations in this area by European Commission, to shift away tax burden from labor, especially low-paid labor, to other tax bases which are less detrimental to growth. So, well, we mention capital, property, consumption, but also environmental taxation. So this clearly is a policy direction which we are already advocating and facilitating within the EU.
Okay, thank you. I'm really interested to see how the country-specific recommendations will be this year, as now, of course, things are very different than before. I will move back now to the topic of what we call the just recovery. So as we have now talked a lot about the green, and we have agreed that both dimensions are really important, the Just Recovery Lab discussed like how can we actually ensure that we keep the crew on board, right? So it's still a ship, right? So we have to keep the crew on board. And one proposal to ensure that was that member states provide universal access to basic goods and services. So for example, Luxembourg currently is testing a free public transport system. So this is also something that might actually be kind of an indirect way of redistribution and supporting poorer households. So what do you think about such ideas and proposals?
This is something which member states are testing. There are different initiatives in different member states. You mentioned Luxembourg. I can mention for a number of years, for example, in Estonia and Tallinn, public transport is for free. Elsewhere, public transport is being subsidized by countries, by municipalities. So, this generally is the direction which we support in the Commission. This is indeed, we were discussing previously, with distribution of competences between European Union and member states. This is a competence of member states, and often this is a competence of municipalities. So, of course, we need to respect also this distribution of competences. but it's true that we should facilitate initiatives like this on free public transport, or at least affordable public transport, is also a good way how to reduce congestions, how to reduce cars on streets, and also to help meet our environmental goals. So policy direction we certainly can support from the Commission.
Okay, thank you. And the second issue that was discussed was the issue of participation. So currently the European semester is an exercise between the Commission and the member states, and there is not so much involvement of civil society and the people that actually are affected by those decisions. So do you see room in the current discussions to design these processes in a more participatory way, so other stakeholders can also contribute to these discussions?
Well, actually, we are moving in this direction, and if you look at how European semester has developed since its beginnings, just after global financial economical crisis, one can see that this participation has been actually strengthened quite a bit. And from European Commission side, we have been very insistent, for example, of member states consulting social partners ahead of critical stages in European semester, ahead of documents which member states are presenting within European semester, like national reform programs or stability or convergence programs. And we ourselves from the Commission are consulting social partners ahead of preparation of our important documents. So this involvement of social partners, involvement of other stakeholders is important, and we continue to reinforce, and we continue to insist that member states are also doing those consultations, because it's very clear that it's important that the documents which member states present, it's not prepared somewhere in some department in finance ministry, but indeed that those documents are part of the domestic political debate, because through this you also get, at the end of the day, better ownership of those documents and policy directions and reforms which member states are implementing.
So what are things that you would recommend to member states to actually achieve that, so people feel more represented in the ideas member states come up with?
Well, as I said, so what we are recommending is that member states are consulting social partners, other stakeholders, ahead of submitting important European semester documents to the European Commission. So this is what we want to ensure, that those documents which are coming already to European Commission, that there has been a domestic political debate, and that there is ownership for those documents, that they are not indeed narrowly produced and submitted, and afterwards it turns out that there's no ownership of those documents.
And what this refers to is, of course, also the issue of governance, right? So you have very different governance levels. So implementation, of course, is always it always depends on whether people feel actually responsible for that. So I think that's a very important point that you raise up here. We also had a policy lab on governance, and especially what governance is needed for resilience. And while you can talk about governance on these different levels, you can also talk about governance in the sense of coherence, right? So how do we actually ensure coherence between different policy objectives? So to use the metaphor of the boat again, so if sails point in like different directions, then the boat might not stay afloat for too long, right? So one group had the idea that now it becomes a little bit technical. I hope the audience knows about EU governance. So one idea that came up was what they called a pollination unit. So it's a unit that has includes members that have a mandate to identify tensions between different policies and the objectives of these policies. And then these members of this unit would actually facilitate a process to come up with other solutions and ideas to address these tensions. So this would, of course, be a way to have maybe a better aligned policy design. And also, if it's done like before a comprehensive impact assessment, there's still maybe room to really include other options in an impact assessment. So what do you think about such an idea of like a pollination unit? Would this be something that might improve coherence between policy objectives?
On this, well, first of all, maybe let me note, since we are on this metaphor of a ship, and as we discussed at the beginning, there are limits to different approaches and different metaphors. And if we discuss governments on the ship, as we know, captain decides and crew implements. That's not necessarily how things work in the EU or in member states. And indeed, it requires a much broader discussion. Well, on this, what you are saying, pollination unit, this is something which reminds me a little bit of the discussions we had in a European Commission of European Commission working in silos, like each Directorate General working in its own silo, producing its own stuff, which then occasionally leads to certain incoherences and inconsistencies. And that's why already in a previous commission, and in this commission we continue, this institute of vice presidents of the commission with a coordinating function has been introduced, that you need to see cross-sector consistency of the policies. And I think it's also very important when we discuss, for example, Green Deal, that we are consistent what we do across different policies, energy, transport, industry, housing, and it all requires also horizontal coordination, whether we do it through, as you call them, pollination units or through other means. I would say it's something which can be discussed, but it's very important to ensure that there is this horizontal coordination.
Exactly. I mean, this was the question that the Policy Lab discussed, right? So how do we achieve that horizontal coordination? Because, of course, you mentioned the captain decides and the crew implements. So this, it doesn't always work that way. You also mentioned that. So sometimes there's a problem of motivation. So people may not be motivated if it's only top down, if they have no say in the things. So I think that was a topic that we raised. So it's important to actually also empower the medium levels and the lower levels to also come up with solutions how horizontal coordination can be improved, right? So these pollination units were somewhere like between the top down and the bottom up approaches to really build a bridge between these things. Yeah, but I think that I hope the group liked that you think this is an interesting idea. So I think we have also a couple of questions from the audience. So I would shortly look here into the questions that came up. So the one question, I have a briefing here. So one question from Benjamin Görlach from Ecologic Institute was that the transformation to climate neutrality requires not only to build a new economic structures, but also overcome existing ones. For example, fossil intensive sectors, exnovation, disinvestment, and managed decline. Are you concerned that addressing such processes might become politically toxic in light of the current recession? So I think what he refers to is we're talking a lot about what we have to support, but we do not talk too much about like maybe a blacklist or dirty list of activities that should not receive support, right? So what would you reply to Benjamin Görlach?
Well, I think it's very clear that if we want to reach carbon neutrality, we'll have to phase out fossil fuels. And the Commission has been very clear about this. And already now, we discussed before, there are many member states which have announced the coal phase out. or which have already phased out coal. And this is, I would say, a classical example. And that was exactly issues like this with which in mind we designed our Just Transition Mechanism and Just Transition Fund. So yes, indeed, we would need to disinvest from coal. We will need to move away from coal production. But then I would say we would not, we shouldn't manage decline. We should manage transformation. So for those coal regions, we should be seeing how we can support those regions with a diversification of the economy, finding new possibilities for people in those regions. And that's, for example, why it's not surprised that if you look at the Just Transition Mechanism, that the biggest beneficiary from this Just Transition Mechanism is going to be Poland, where exactly they have major coal regions where the coal production will have to be phased out.
Thank you. But there are also other sectors, if we look in the long term, that are facing these transitions, right? So what are the industries that you think are most important, like if you think further than coal, where you have to think about really systemic modernization and very fundamental changes?
Well, first of all, we discuss fossil fuels. Probably coal is a first in line. Afterwards, we can discuss oil at a certain stage, natural gas. For example, let me give a bit thinking how we are looking at natural gas. When we were developing EU classification system of green economic activities, or so-called taxonomy, we were devising what we call transition activities, and actually it's two types of transition activities. For example, if you look at natural gas, it may very well be that natural gas will be part of the picture in 2030, because if you are phasing out coal, often the simplest and fastest alternative is to switch to natural gas. But likely that natural gas will not be part of the picture in 2050 when we will be reaching climate neutrality. So just to give one example, or another way of transition activities, energy intensive sectors. Take, for example, steel or cement, classical energy intensive sectors. There, what we mean with the transition activities are projects which have substantially lower emissions and are substantially cleaner than industry average. So there the transition is really towards cleaner production, because it's likely that we are still going to need steel and cement also in 2050. So we need to reduce the pollution in the production of those goods. So just to give some examples.
You mentioned the green taxonomy, and Cedric Pacheo also asked the question. I think it fits quite well to that topic. So what does Fit for 50/50 mean for the initiatives targeting financial markets? So how can financial market participants help the transition on top of the 2018 action plan?
On this, well, when we are discussing green finance, indeed, we in 2018 we came with an action plan, or Green on Sustainable Finance, and 3 concrete legislative proposals, which are all now agreed and adopted. As I was mentioning in my introductory remarks, we are preparing a new sustainable or green finance action plan, which will be presenting by the end of the year. So clearly, financial sector will have an important role to play here, and we will be coming with a new action plan looking what are the next steps. To give some work directions, we'll be looking at the amendments of non-financial reporting directive on climate-related disclosures, how we can further strengthen this, and also moving more from, so to say, non-binding guidelines to binding reporting requirements. We intend to develop EU green bond standards, eco-labels for financial products, especially retail financial products, just to give some examples, which we are now preparing in this new Green Finance Action Plan. And we are continuing to advance it internationally. Soon, the international platform of sustainable finance will be 1 year old, where we are working together with other countries, including, for example, China and India, but excluding for certain reasons US, which didn't want to participate, where we are looking on how we set the standards for sustainable finance internationally. Because of course it's better that it's done internationally consistently, because, well, global finance is mobile. We don't want to create fragmentation, so it's better that we approach it in a globally coordinated way.
You mentioned those, like, I forgot the name, those activities by business that no, let's skip that one. I forgot the name, but we have another question from Michael Roth. I think it fits also to your new profile, because you recently you are now designated Commissioner for Trade also, right? So Michael Roth asks, what can the EU do in order to induce other important global players, for example, China and the US, to become more sustainable? Would the EU be willing to exert pressure via trade policy?
Well, yes, it's clear that if we are serious about fighting climate change, it's important that we get others on board, because EU produces around 9% of global emissions. So even if we move to the carbon neutrality, it's important that other countries also move towards the same goal. And that's why we're engaging with US, with China. Of course, the first and clear avenue is Paris Agreement. Well, US has withdrawn from that, as we know. But of course, we're working with other countries who are part of the Paris Agreement, that it's really being implemented, and EU will continue to be very active on this. We have consistently strengthened sustainable development chapters in our free trade agreements with third countries, with regions. We are now, for example, for a future free trade agreements, we are now undertaking the review of EU trade policy. But one idea which Commission considers to put forward is that we would be asking in the negotiating directives which we are receiving, having adherence to Paris Agreement as an essential element. So this is something which we want to move forward. Give a concrete example now, agreement with Mercosur. It's clear that we would need strong engagement with Brazil concerning the deforestation, or rather stopping the deforestation, in order to be able to successfully move forward with Mercosur free trade agreement. So clearly, when we want to implement EU Green Deal, trade policy will also have a role to play.
So are these already some of the details that shine through when the president, in her speech, I think she said something that there will be like negotiations about reforming WTO rules. So is this something that falls under this? And are there any other things that you think are important on a WTO level that have to change to make sure that trade is aligned with the Paris Agreement?
Well, yes, this is also one work direction concerning the WTO reform. Also, I would say the question of liberalization of the trade in environmental goods. We want this technology, so to say, to spread internationally. But when we discuss WTO reform, it must be said that there are also issues which go to very core of the functioning of WTO, because it's very problematic right now. Appellate body is not working, negotiating function is not really functioning. So WTO is in very serious crisis. And so from EU side, we will be insisting a lot on WTO reform to bring it up to the speed with the current challenges in international trade, and that includes sustainability.
Very much looking forward to the ideas that are going to be presented in that direction. We have one last question, and I think then you have to leave. So one participant asked that there are indications that some systemic solutions identified revolve around higher skills for individuals and shifts from global supply chains to more integrated local ones. So, for example, avoiding shipping components internationally multiple times and assembling finished products, for example. So the complexity of supply chains as, it's a systemic problem maybe also. So how will the EU bring on board powerful global companies who may feel threatened by such a systemic shift, and the shift about like to more integrated local supply chains?
There is a systemic shift ongoing. Well, there are some maybe weaknesses which are exposed also by the COVID pandemic. So we are looking how to reinforce, how to strengthen, how to diversify the supply chains concerning medical goods and medicines, how to strengthen EU's autonomy in this area, because what pandemics has exposed that relying on single suppliers in especially a situation in crisis is dangerous, because then it turns out that exactly when you need the medical goods most, you cannot really get them, or you cannot get them on time when it's needed. So this is one very concrete work direction we are currently working within the EU, but also we have brought it up internationally in the WTO context. But it's also a broader tendency on when we are discussing how to strengthen EU's economic resilience. We are looking exactly at those issues. And there are also certain technological tendencies which are probably driving the globalization in a different direction. When we discuss global supply chains, very often this global production model was driven by labor cost differences. If you look now, that many industries are less labor intensive, and you see lots of reshoring, so to say, of industries and decentralized solutions in a number of areas. Additive manufacturing, 3D printing, things like this will contribute to this tendency. So we are here also going through very complex shifts, so to say.
So thank you, Valdis Dombrovskis. I think you have to leave already to your next appointment. So thanks so much for staying with us and giving us the opportunity to get your thoughts on some of the ideas that we have developed during this week. I'm very much looking forward to maybe work together with some of your colleagues in developing these ideas further. And for you first, have a good day, and hopefully, like keep the ship afloat and be a captain with the right compass, with the sails pointing in the right direction. I'm looking forward to maybe speak again at another occasion. So I will stay here, and maybe to the listeners online.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. So maybe we fix that first. There's no applause online. That's so bad. I think people are probably applauding right now. So I also want to thank you. Maybe we can see the previous slide. I also want to thank our partners that made this conference possible. We had a lot of content partners that contributed with inputs in the policy labs. We had a lot of also co-creation partners, in particular Politics for Tomorrow, who contributed and supported us with the development of the methodologies. And also I want to thank our funders, Laudes Foundation, KR Foundation, and Partners for Union Economy, who made this online conference possible. And of course, I also want to invite the participants to have a look at our Twitter and have a look at our homepage, so you can register for our newsletter. And I'm very much looking forward to see you, hopefully physically, soon at another event. And well, I'll leave it like this. We will follow up with the results from the conference via email, and I hope you will have a good weekend.